Day. On the same day that Secretary of State Blinken was being overwhelmed by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi over the course of what gives every appearance of having been a fraught and difficult telephone call, that is to say, on 27th January 2022, President Biden of the United States appears to have been having a similar fraught telephone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine. Now, we have a serious difficulty trying to understand exactly what took place over the course of this call. This is that it turns out that the readouts that the two governments have provided of this call are unusually uninformative, in fact totally uninformative and totally unreliable if we are to believe the media rumours that are circulating about this call. I suspect those media rumours are true, in which case we are driven to disregard the readouts, which give the usual appearance of cooperation and harmony. The one thing we know for a fact about this call between Biden and Zelensky on the 27th of January, is that it went on for 1.5 hours. In other words, it was an exceptionally long call. We also have heard from the Ukrainians, and this is essentially confirmed, that the Ukrainians told President Biden to calm down some of the rhetoric about the imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine that we've been hearing about over such a long period of time. Now, those words, calm down, might actually point to something else, because some of the media reports that have circulated about this conversation speak of an intense row with President Biden of the United States allegedly yelling at Zelensky. I would say that, though of course I don't know for a fact that that is the case, it has become increasingly clear over the last year that Biden has an extremely short temper and sometimes finds it difficult to keep it under control. For example, that extraordinary outburst the other day at the end of a press conference in which he replied angrily and ironically to a question about inflation, that inflation was an asset instead of a liability, and then spoke in the most coarse way in the full view of the press room about the journalist who asked the question. That is only one example of many of President Biden's difficulty in keeping control of his temper. Well, I stress again that though I find it possible to believe that he did lose his temper over the course of this call, I don't know it for a fact, but I would add that if Biden did indeed yell at Zelensky, then the words attributed to Zelensky telling Biden to calm down might have an entirely different meaning. It might have been a case of Zelensky telling Biden to calm down, in other words, to stop yelling, as opposed to Zelensky telling Biden to calm down about the threat of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Anyway, all these rumours, all these speculations give rise to feelings that this was a particularly heated call. Now, we have a further problem, because if the readouts are uninformative and unreliable, some of the press comments are probably not particularly reliable either. The media outlet that first gave us a clear indication that something went seriously wrong with the call was CNN. It was briefed by a person whom it refers to as a senior Ukrainian official that the call did not go well, that there was essentially a row between Zelensky and Biden about the true threat of a Russian invasion to Ukraine, and that the United States made clear to Zelensky that there was limits to the amount of military aid that Ukraine would receive. So the senior Ukrainian official, always anonymous, appears to have given a rather vivid account of the conversation. But within hours of that CNN story appearing, both the Americans and the Ukrainians were denying the report and claiming that it was disinformation, and implying, improbably, that it was somehow Russian disinformation. Though why a senior Ukrainian official would be circulating disinformation on behalf of Russia, it's difficult to understand. Anyway, predictably, CNN itself then began to have all kinds of problems. It didn't entirely retract the story, but it stopped mentioning it or referencing it, and then it came up with all kinds of attempts to reconcile the story to the different separate accounts that the US administration and the Ukrainians officially were giving about it. And the result is that the CNN reports about the story are now a complete mess and can no longer be taken as being particularly informative or reliable. However, the story has now been picked up by much of the foreign media. There was a long article about it all, for example, in Britain's Daily Mail. And in fact, we have much in that article in the Daily Mail all about the situation, the increasingly fraught situation between Zelensky and Biden. Well, that's as much as we know about the call, but that it was a difficult call and that the two leaders disagreed and disagree about the threat to Ukraine of a Russian invasion was further confirmed by a press conference that Zelensky gave on the following day, on Friday the 28th of January 2022. Over the course of that press conference or statement, Zelensky went out of his way to say that the media and some world leaders, because he didn't specify who, but it does seem that Biden and perhaps Britain's Boris Johnson are the ones who are being specifically identified, that they are being alarmist about the threat of a Russian invasion and that there is no need to panic. So there we go. There's also, by the way, reports that Zelensky tried to explain to Biden over the course of that very heated call on Thursday that the meeting, the Normandy 4 meeting on the previous day in Paris, had actually gone well, that after 8 hours of tough negotiation, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the French and the Germans had actually made some ground about securing the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine, and that far from actual tensions in the area in eastern Ukraine and on the Ukrainian border getting worse, they are actually starting to get better. Apparently, Zelensky also told Biden that these continuous alarmist stories about the threat of a Russian invasion of Ukraine are causing severe damage, mounting damage to the Ukrainian economy. The United States has said that it will try to support Ukraine through these problems, and apparently the word is that Zelensky then followed that up with an immediate demand for $5 billion. So, all a mess, all extraordinarily difficult to know exactly what happened, but all the indications are that there was indeed some kind of a row on Thursday between Biden and Zelensky. And of course, Zelensky, to all intents and purposes, confirmed this on the following day when he accused parts of the media and Western governments of panic mongering over the situation on the Ukrainian border and cast doubt on the entire premise that a Russian invasion of Ukraine is imminent. I'm going to say something further, which is, of course, it's not just Zelensky who is now openly contradicting the Americans on this issue. There have also been further statements by other Ukrainian officials that seem to go out of their way to contradict various stories about the danger of an imminent Russian attack that are floating around the media. Just to give one example, a couple of days ago, Reuters, the British news agency, circulated a story based on the usual anonymous officials, American anonymous officials, to the extent that one is able to tell, about how the Russians were now positioning blood banks and medical units together with their troops in European Russia, all of which seemed to suggest that a Russian attack on Ukraine was imminent. Within hours of that Reuters report, a Ukrainian official came out and contradicted it. The official in question apparently said, I saw a brief report of this, which has now unsurprisingly disappeared. The Ukrainian official went out of her way, I recall that she was a lady, to say that there was simply no truth to the story. So there we go. We have a massive row between the United States and Ukraine underway. And one of the great paradoxes about this whole situation, about this so-called crisis around Ukraine, is that it has actually brought relations between Ukraine and the United States, these two supposed allies, to their worst point since the Maidan events of February 2014. The Maidan events, as we know, brought to power in Ukraine a fervently pro-American, fervently pro-EU, fervently pro-NATO, fervently anti-Russian government. Zelensky is the inheritor of that political tradition. You would have thought, therefore, that he would be favourable or sympathetic to the United States. And, of course, the United States, over the last few weeks, and indeed months, has been talking endlessly and relentlessly about its loyalty to Ukraine and about the danger to Ukraine and about the actions that the United States is taking to ensure that there is no Russian invasion of Ukraine. Well, in fact, and in consequence, what is actually now happening is that the Ukrainians and the Americans are just about avoiding an open public row about a threat of invasion, with the Ukrainians, as I said, going out of their way to contradict what the Americans are saying, and the Americans, for their part, showing increasing signs of exasperation. And that the Americans are becoming increasingly exasperated by the Ukrainians has been confirmed in a long article by Julia Ioffe, a journalist, a US journalist who's reasonably well informed about things in the United States. She's quite close to the Democrats, she's quite close to the administration, and she's written a long article for Pop News called Inside the Biden-Putin Chess Match, and the article is behind a paywall, but rather helpfully she has told us, perhaps she's identified what is perhaps the most important paragraph in this article in a tweet. She says the White House and its Democratic allies have just about had it with President Zelensky. According to 3 sources in the administration and on the Hill, the Ukrainian president is by turn annoying, infuriating, and downright counterproductive. And further down in the article, Yoffe says that Zelensky doesn't understand American politics. He doesn't understand how to chart his way around the the U.S. political class. He manages to tread on everybody's toes, and people find him incredibly irritating. Now, I have to say, if that is true, and I'm sure it is true, then it does show an extraordinarily warped sense of understanding on the part of the American political class. Something, by the way, which to her credit, Yoffe herself points out, which is that why should it be Zelensky's business to know exactly what is going on in the minds of American politicians? Surely his job is not to care about the feelings of American politicians, but to protect the interests of his own country. Anyway, that article by Julia Yoffe appeared on the 25th of January in the run-up to this conversation between Biden and Zelensky, and it shows that the mood between the Americans and the Ukrainians had by this point already turned extremely ugly. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, the fact that there is so much anger apparently in Washington about Zelensky is now leading to rumors of an attempted coup by the United States against Zelensky himself. And in fact, it is the case that for the last couple of weeks, Zelensky has been talking about the fact that there are plots against him in Ukraine, the fact that various politicians are trying to are maneuvering to remove him. He's talked about actions by the Ukrainian oligarch Rinat Akhmetov, and of course he tried to bring, or is trying to bring, treason charges against his predecessor, President Poroshenko, who, however, managed to avoid an arrest warrant, allegedly with help from the US Embassy. So it's not inconceivable that there are some moves against Zelensky underway in Ukraine, and that the United States might indeed be backing them. All I would say about this is that if the United States is indeed thinking of taking action to remove Zelensky from power, then it needs to be extremely careful. This whole episode, if there is a coup, bears some resemblance to what happened in 1963 when the United States backed a coup in South Vietnam against the country's president, President Godin Diem. The coup succeeded. Diem and his brother and various other members of his government were killed, and a new, more compliant government did take power in Saigon. But the violent ouster of President Diem destroyed whatever remaining stability and legitimacy the South Vietnamese government had. And the result was that South Vietnam never was able to right itself and to achieve stability, even as the war with North Vietnam and with the Viet Cong intensified. I think most people who now look back on the coup against President Diem of South Vietnam now feel that the whole role of the United States in that coup was massively misjudged, and that the entire episode was ultimately a disaster, and one which backfired hideously against the United States, and by the way, against South Vietnam itself. Well, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does sometimes rhyme. And if there is a similar coup against Zelensky, in which, by the way, I would sincerely hope that no harm did come to him. Well, my own feeling is that given attitudes in Ukraine at the moment about the situation there, I think it would be extraordinarily unwise for the United States and would have similar consequences for the United States, quite possibly, as the situation before had when President Ziem was, as I said, removed from office in the way that I've said. So I think that this is an extremely bad idea if anybody is indeed playing with it. And perhaps it might be helpful at this point to discuss certain facts about the internal mood in Ukraine itself, because it shows how fraught the situation in Ukraine has become and how according to the internal polling, the mood in Ukraine is profoundly different from the way in which it has been reported in the Western media. Now, here I'm going to be careful. I'm not going to provide any links to the polling. It originates with an institute called the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, and it's based upon a nationwide poll that was conducted in December. I'm not going to provide links because this poll was pointed out to me by a third party who has emailed me with its details. I'm sure if you want to all look it up, you can find it. But anyway, I'm going to read from the email that I've been given. It reads as follows. The pollsters reached 2,000 responders nationwide based on random generation of cell phone numbers. Upon contact, the survey was conducted using an automated system. Any regional discrepancies in respondent volumes relevant relative to regional population were mathematically adjusted in terms of contribution to nationwide results. Response outcomes were broken down into categories, including region of Ukraine, west, center, south, east, gender, age range, rural versus urban, and voting preference, both in terms of party and support for various likely presidential candidates. And then there's some discussion about the nature of the questions, and the poll reads, of the available answers to the questions, 2 are oriented around resistance. Other available answers are leave for another safer region, leave the country, I will do nothing, I don't know, or refuse to answer. And the 2 resistance-oriented answers are 1, offer armed resistance to the Russians, and 2, resist by way of participation in acts of civil resistance, such as demonstrations, protests, marches, boycotts, strikes, civil disobedience. And respondents were able to select one or both of the resistance-oriented answers, or alternatively, one or more of the non-resistance answers. And the poll then went on to find that of those questioned, just 50.2% of respondents picked one or both of the resistance answers. Men were much more likely to choose armed resistance, women much more likely to choose civil resistance. And as has been pointed out, this means that 49.8% of Ukrainian citizens would not even so much as join a strike or engage in peaceful civil disobedience if Russia invaded their own town. Then he goes on. As foreign policy realists have been saying for years, eastern Ukraine is quite favourable to Russia. Now we have documentary proof of this from a mainstream Ukrainian source. Only 37.2% of residents in eastern Ukraine exclusive of the rebel parts of Donetsk and Lugansk, which were not surveyed, would undertake any kind of resistance to Russian invasion of their own town. Naturally, this low proportion would be much lower if the rebel parts of Donetsk and Lugansk were included in the survey. What this means is that 62.8% of eastern Ukrainian residents, exclusive of areas no longer under Ukrainian control, would not even so much as join a strike or engage in peaceful civil disobedience if Russia invaded their town. And then the south of Ukraine is not looking much better. Only 43% would undertake any kind of resistance if Russia came to their town. The most pro-Russian areas here would be those immediately bordering Crimea, as well as Odessa province, some distance to the west, on the Black Sea coast. The further inland from the Black Sea, certainly the population becomes more Ukrainian and anti-Russian. And then, of course, the point is that the survey doesn't, of course, include Crimea itself. And then it goes on and says, you'd think the younger crowd would be more eager to resist because they have no memory of the USSR and their brains have been washed through the modern Ukrainian educational system. Yes, that makes sense, but it's wrong. Remarkably, aside from the 70-plus crowd, the age group least likely to resist is the youngest group in the survey, the 18 to 29-year-olds. The future of Ukraine, they don't even want their own country. Nationwide, only 43% of 18 to 29-year-olds would resist, as opposed to, for example, 59.5% of 40 to 49-year-olds, the most enthusiastic age group. So, the people who would fight for Ukraine are people in their 40s, young people, the kind of people that armies ultimately need in order to carry out a successful resistance. They don't seem to be at all enthusiastic. But it gets worse. As the article points out, 57% of 18 to 29-year-olds in Ukraine would not even so much as join a strike or engage in peaceful disobedience if Russia invaded their town. But then it goes on to say that close to half of Ukraine's 18 to 29-year-olds are no longer even in Ukraine. So we're talking about less than half of a demographic of which half has already left. So there we go. The idea that if you remove Zelensky, you will get some kind of strong government in Ukraine, which will take a more anti-Russian line. It seems to me that engineering a coup against Zelensky, just as happened with President Diem in Vietnam, would simply destroy whatever remaining credibility and legitimacy the Ukrainian political system has left. It's quite possible that if there was such a coup, Ukraine would unravel. And moreover, if there were a war between Ukraine and Russia, the idea that there would be an armed resistance to Russia is, frankly, fantastical. The idea that there would be a partisan war against Russia is, frankly, fantastical. The only section of Ukraine's population which shows any enthusiasm for such a war are Ukrainians in their 40s, and which was, of course, the age group which had its views formed 30 years ago, at the time when the Soviet Union broke up. The vital age group, the key age group in any war the 18 to 29-year-olds are deeply unenthusiastic and are not around anyway in sufficient numbers. So it's not an edifying picture by any means. And I would add that if you believe in the desire of Ukraine to resist, and you find the fact that people like Zelensky are dragging their feet, and you imagine that maybe there is political support within Ukraine's elite to remove him, I would say again, be extremely careful in what you suppose. No doubt there are some passionate nationalists in Ukraine who are as exasperated by President Zelensky as the United States appears to be. But I wonder whether the key political decision-making class in Ukraine, the oligarchs, share the enthusiasm for a war that with Russia, that the nationalists in Ukraine and perhaps some people in Washington appear to have. I say that because a war in Ukraine, which ended in the destruction of Ukraine, would end inevitably in the destruction of the whole source of those oligarchs' wealth. In their own self-interest, one would expect that they would be backing at this time Zelensky when he was telling the Americans to calm down, to tone down all this rhetoric about a Russian invasion of Ukraine, rather than any ultra-nationalists who might be at this moment in time seeking to overthrow Zelensky in order to make some kind of more muscular policy against Russia possible. So if there is a plan for a coup, it's an extremely bad idea. And all this rhetoric, this relentless rhetoric against this mythological Russian invasion, far from helping or assisting Ukraine, is undermining its economy and is creating tensions between Ukraine and the United States, which we have not seen up to now. So there we are. That's the situation as it seems to me at the moment. There is one further thing to say about this. It is indeed extremely bizarre, really almost ludicrous that Ukraine denies that it is being threatened by an attack, and then it is the United States which insists it is. If it is true that President Biden was yelling at President Zelensky to tell him that an attack on Ukraine is pending, then it becomes even more bizarre, because it seems most strange that a country which feels itself secure is being told by another country far away that it is not secure and must fear an invasion of which that country sees and senses no sign. It is very odd, and it does give rise to the inevitable suspicion, I am sure, not just amongst Russians, but I suspect amongst an increasing number of Ukrainians and an increasing number of people in Europe, that the United States, for some incomprehensible reason, actually wants to see a war in Ukraine. It actually wants some kind of conflict between Ukraine and Russia, even if the price of that conflict would be the destruction of Ukraine itself. That is an astonishing thought if you take a step and think about what it means. And it does beg some questions. I wonder whether it's true. I wonder whether it's true of every single official in the US government. I wonder specifically whether it's true of people in the economic agencies of the US government or in the Pentagon. But I have to say that some of these latest arguments, some of this attempt to try to persuade Ukraine itself that there's going to be an attack on Ukraine by Russia. All of that does make it look as if somebody in Washington is trying to engineer a war. Well, perhaps they are, but I'm going to offer another possible explanation for all of this. It's difficult to understand exactly, as I said, what the United States thought it was doing when back in November it started to beat the war drums and claimed that there was a threat of a war against Ukraine, a threat that the Ukrainians themselves can't see, that the Europeans can't see either, and which the Russians have never threatened. As I said, there's the abiding mystery as to what was the motivation behind this decision to start to create this crisis out of nowhere. I've speculated, I've made some guesses about it might be, for example, an attempt to bolster President Biden's poll ratings to get him to appear a kind of JFK figure, or it might be to put pressure on the new German government to take a harder anti-Russian line, or something like that. But I suspect that having started this particular ball rolling, the United States is now beginning to realize that it can't really bring it to a stop. Perhaps the calculation was that as this rhetoric heated up, as the threat of sanctions grew, the Russians would say, well, we got no plan to invade Ukraine, so we're going to draw down some of our troops in European Russia. Having done that, the administration would have been able to say, well, we won a great victory. The Russians have blinked. They pulled back their forces from the border, and we've achieved this great strategic win. The problem is that the Russians are refusing to do that. They're refusing to make any concessions about military deployments at all. They're refusing even to discuss this issue. And that has pushed the United States into an open-ended crisis in which it has no realistic way out other than perhaps by instigating that war, which from an American point of view, one would have thought it would want to avoid. Anyway, that is just a thought. I am not going to press the point too far because, as I said, it's very difficult at this moment in time to try to get into the American mind, or at least the Biden administration's mind, and try to work out what it's doing. But the overall message is that whatever this war scare is about, it has managed to bring relations between the United States and Ukraine to crisis point. It has now led to rumors of a coup, which are going to destabilize the situation, the internal situation in Ukraine even further. And it is doing so at a time when increasing amounts of polling data are showing that the popular mood in Ukraine, far from being defiant against the Russians, as much of the media in the United States is trying to pretend, is on the contrary cynical and disillusioned, and most likely will respond to any further coup in Kiev with skepticism and perhaps even hostility, bringing the whole Ukrainian house of cards closer to that point when it all falls down. Anyway, that's enough from me today. I hope you will join me again in my next video. I hope you will join me also in the programs I do with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou on the Duran. You will find links under this video. Also, Please remember to join us on our locals platform, where I do live streams every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. You can find me there. You can ask me questions. If you choose to become an active member, you're very welcome to do so. You can also, if you like, post your own exclusive content on our locals platform. And by the way, both Alex and I publish exclusive content on that platform also. I've done another program recently, for example, on the sanctions issue, all this talk about sanctions between Russia, the United States and Russia, which is exclusive to locals. You can find it on locals as well. And of course, we're not just on locals, we're on plenty of other platforms also: BitChute, Library, Rumble, Odyssey, Super U. We also now have our own television channel where you can find all our videos back to back. Links under this video for that TV channel also. And of course, you can support our work if you value it by via Patreon and Subscribestar, by buying from the amazing things you will find in our shop: our t-shirts, our hats, our hoods, our magic mugs, and all the rest. And of course, through ticking the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and by checking your subscription to this channel. Anyway, that's enough from me today. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon as we look at the further developments, the twists and turns in this crisis. I predict that my next program will be about the conversation between Macron and Putin, and about what the new leader of Germany's CDU party, Friedrich Merz, the man who may one day be Chancellor of Germany, probably quite soon in fact, what he has to say about this crisis, which is actually extremely interesting, and also about the prospects for an internal Ukrainian settlement via the Normandy 4 process. So you can find all that very soon in my next program, and I look forward to you joining me then, and have a very good day.